Good afternoon. I'm John Corrigan, professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at The Ohio State University and National Research Director for the Brain Injury Association of America. On behalf of the Brain Injury Association of America, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. Today's attendees are all muted. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Zoom question and answer feature, and our speaker will answer them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, we are unable to provide medical advice during this presentation. For any medical questions or concerns, please consult your healthcare professional. Next slide. As the voice of brain injury in the United States, the mission of the Brain Injury Association is to improve the quality of life of people affected by brain injury across their lifespan through advancing prevention, awareness, research, treatment, education, and advocacy. We have many programs and activities at BIAA, but I want to quickly spotlight a few today. Next slide. Through the Academy of Certified Brain Injury Specialists, or ACBS, BIAA improves the standard of care given to people with brain injury by providing specialized training and a voluntary certification program for both direct care staff and professionals working in brain injury services. Next slide. The National Brain Injury Information Center, or NBIC, is a free program that supports individuals and families who experience the life-changing effects of a brain injury. Compassionate, knowledgeable brain injury specialists at NBIC offer user-friendly information and assist those who reach out to find needed information and services. Next slide. The National Brain Injury Conference and Awareness Day is being held again this year in Washington, D.C. on March 9th to 11th. This is a fabulous event that I encourage you to attend. Next slide. And the conference is just one of the events planned in March to celebrate Brain Injury Awareness Month. Next slide. A project pertinent to our topic today and for which BIA is an endorsing organization is the international initiative to have traumatic brain injury recognized by the World Health Assembly as a notifiable and chronic condition. Next slide. There are a number of countries that have joined this effort, as well as national and international organizations shown here. We are looking toward passage of this resolution in 2027. Next slide. Thank you again for attending today. And now I'd like to introduce Katie Bowman from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine.
Thank you so much, John. And on behalf of the National Academies and our Forum on Traumatic Brain Injury, it's a pleasure to be jointly convening this webinar with BIAA. We're really looking forward to the conversation and the presentation. Next slide. Our ongoing forum was established in 2022, and it brings together a number of experts and leaders and participants across federal agencies, clinical and research communities, patient and family organizations, industry, nonprofits, and others who are really interested in what we can do to advance prevention, care, and research for traumatic brain injury. So through its meetings and its workshops and other activities, the forum provides a venue for these cross-sectoral participants to share learnings and foster collaboration and advance strategies to improve research and care for this condition. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight one recent activity. So in 2025, the forum hosted a workshop on TBI as a chronic condition organized by this excellent planning committee. And so a summary of the presentations and discussions from that event is now available. There's a QR code there, and you should be able to download it or read it for free online if you're interested in learning more about that. That workshop highlighted a number of the longer term symptoms that can occur after TBI and what is needed to improve care and outcomes for people and families contending with this condition. Then I think I'm going to turn it back to you, John, to introduce our featured speaker.
Thank you. Our presenter today is Dr. Kristen Doms O'Connor. She is the director of the Brain Injury Research Center at Mount Sinai in New York City. The center is an internationally recognized program studying and training persons with traumatic brain injury, treating persons with traumatic brain injury. She is the Jack Nash Professor and Vice Chair of Research in the Department of Rehabilitation and Human Performance and Professor of Neurology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Doms O'Connor completed her BA in neuroscience at Colgate University, a PhD at SUNY Albany, and predoctoral training at the Rusk Institute at NYU. She completed postdoctoral fellowship in clinical neuropsychology and brain injury research and joined the faculty at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai as an assistant professor in 2011. Dr. Kristen Doms O'Connor has been a valued colleague for many years and has made very important contributions to the traumatic brain injury model systems. I know you will find this afternoon's presentation informative. Kristen.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Are you able to see the first slide?
Yes, now.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, I'd like to just acknowledge the support that has allowed a lot of the research that I'm going to be talking about today to go forward. And start with what I truly feel has been a seminal paper in this area of work. This was a call to action. Dr. Maisel and Dr. DeWitt wrote this paper 15, 16 years ago. And many of us read this paper and we said, yes, this is what we have been seeing for years. We have been seeing, many of us were feeling like we were serving as almost like quarterbacks for our patients' very complex care needs. And that was at least for the people fortunate enough to be connected to specialized centers. And even then, there are just not enough specialists, general care. Primary care providers are sometimes wary to treat patients with brain injury because of the clinical complexity. We needed more, we needed better, and this was a pivotal turning point. This paper lays out the ways in which a chronic brain injury meets World Health Organization definitions of a chronic disease, and I think it began what has now become a shift in the way we conceptualize chronic brain injury. So why is it helpful to conceptualize TBI as a chronic disease? Uh, One is it is an educational tool. Um, this notion can also empower survivors to ask for the long-term care that they need and deserve. It's an advocacy tool for healthcare and for systems change. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. This conceptualization can validate the experience of many survivors. Thinking of brain injury as a chronic disease is not intended to prognosticate or predict the future. Brain injury as a chronic condition does not mean that all or even most people with a brain injury will experience long-term symptoms or progression. The goal is to improve care for those who need it. There's a long list of chronic conditions that do not impact people's daily life because they are well managed. What we're talking about today, is never going to be as simple as a pill a day, but we can dramatically reduce the extent to which a traumatic brain injury impacts the quality of a person's day-to-day life. So, what is the evidence? Advocacy requires evidence. No one's going to move mountains to revolutionize care standards without evidence demonstrating the need. And insurance companies are not going to pay for a need that has not been scientifically established. So when I've talked about brain injury as a chronic condition, which I think many of us have for years, I've heard a range of reactions. One is from primary care providers who sometimes say it's just sedentary lifestyle. After a brain injury, some people don't get out and about quite as much, and fix the problem. look, there are major important contributions to activity that we well know when it comes to overall health and function. But this conceptualization doesn't jive with the other common refrain, which is that the brain controls everything, right? We're talking about the nervous system controlling or at least influencing all other body systems. There's a long list of health comorbidities that are common in some survivors of traumatic brain injury. Here is a list. It is not exhaustive. Some of these are very clearly causally related to a brain injury, post-traumatic headache, post-traumatic hypopituitarism. So there's a range of the extent to which we can easily connect the dots between a brain injury and some of these conditions. But again, what is the evidence? So let's just for a moment consider the biological mechanisms through which a traumatic brain injury can cause some of these conditions. We'll start with sleep, which is life impacting. It affects 30 to 70% of individuals have some type of a sleep disturbance after a traumatic brain injury. When the brainstem, for example, is physically altered, this is the area of the brain that tends to regulate wakefulness. That impacts sleep. The dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which is the red area on this image, this is huge for regulating slow sleep waves. And so that can disrupt the propagation of healthy sleep. Endocrine function, very commonly disrupted after a brain injury. Focal injury to the hypothalamus can result from trauma, and this can cause endocrine dysfunction, disrupting hormone regulation. We know that hypopituitarism or growth hormone deficiencies can result from damage to the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland, which is it's particularly vulnerable to shearing forces during head trauma. I'll say also that post-traumatic epilepsy can result when a focal injury becomes an epicenter for seizure activity, and focal seizures can evolve into bilateral tonic-clonic seizures. Post-traumatic headache. This is an area that's gotten more attention lately. And there are a range of neurovascular, neuroinflammatory, metabolic contributors to different types of post-traumatic headache. I'll note, though, that a theme in a lot of this evidence is neurovascular injury, persistent neurovascular and systemic inflammation and dysregulation that can propagate and exacerbate many of these conditions. What about depression and mood disorders? So, advanced neuroimaging studies are beginning to show us that dopamine receptor abnormalities are detectable that distinguish people with TBI from control, suggesting that possibly there are different pathways of depression after TBI. These same pathways distinguish people with TBI who do and do not report depression. Substance use disorders. Some of these same dopaminergic circuits are implicated, as well as structural changes to reward circuitry in the brain, both of which are exacerbated by chronic neuroinflammation. Obviously, there are many psychosocial contributors, cognitive changes after a brain injury, impulsivity, a tendency to want to self-medicate, misuse, intentional or not, of prescription medications. Digestive system changes can result from disruptions to the autonomic nervous system and can alter digestive function and the gut-brain axis, which we're hearing much more about more recently. Metabolic dysfunction, this is quite a picture, but this comes from a really nice paper that came out in 2024 that's really trying to better understand the pathogenesis of how a traumatic brain injury acutely can evolve into a chronic disease, including alteration of cellular metabolism and mitochondrial dysfunction. This is an area that contributes to a lot of the conditions that we're talking about today. Cardiovascular disease is another thing that I find myself thinking about a lot lately. This slide comes from a large cohort of individuals with and without TBI. We have the people with TBI broken into two severity groups. And you can see that almost like a dose-response relationship between injury severity and cardiovascular disease probability. And the index of cardiovascular disease here is it includes things like coronary artery disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obesity. I read this paper when it first came out and had the opportunity to write a brief commentary about it. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I found this work to be so exciting because it begins to point us towards personalized prevention opportunities. This will require definitely a very nuanced understanding of how distinct head trauma exposures individually or synergistically interact with modifiable risk factors and social determinants of health to influence the risk of cardiovascular disease and the many downstream consequences of these diseases. Turning back to Dr. Maisel's original paper, some of the early evidence for TBI as a chronic condition came from mortality studies. And colleagues in the model systems have had opportunities to build upon this work. And we do tend to see that compared to the general population, people who survive at least a year after a traumatic brain injury, they experience a shortened lifespan up to 9 years, depending on the study. And here you see some of the reasons for mortality in this population that greatly exceed the general population. We then have to grapple with the question of whether these chronic diseases are more common in TBI survivors than in the general population. So thinking back to that list of conditions we saw earlier, we realized that we were lacking comparison groups. A lot of the work was coming from TBI cohort studies. So we saw really high and alarming rates of some chronic health conditions, but that's not as compelling as it needs to be. What we've seen, though, is that when we look deeply into studies that look at other outcomes, often in these studies, there is buried a table that compares the TBI group to a control group. And across these studies, we see that nearly every chronic condition is more common in those with a traumatic brain injury. Then we need to think about, did the TBI cause these health problems? Maybe TBI, maybe people who sustain a TBI were already having more health conditions than those who never go on to sustain an injury. That's absolutely something that's worth considering. And we do have some evidence that, yes, many people go into a brain injury with some degree of medical comorbidity. We are now thinking more about TBI as being disease causative, initiating new medical conditions, and also potentially disease accelerative, which means that conditions that pre-existed the injury can get worse over time. Dr. Flora Hammond led a study using the TBI model system data where she started to pull apart these sort of trajectories of comorbidity. So you see the rates here of conditions that were present before a TBI. In the middle is conditions that were present as of the time of injury per self-report. And what you see in the last column is that, yes, these conditions overlay one another. They become cumulative, as does their impact on overall health and function. Dr. Rajkumar, also using data from the TBI model system, after having worked together with many of our colleagues to collect new data in individuals in the TBI model system study, asking questions that are exact replicas of those from another nationwide study that allowed us to have a comparison group, a control group. And as you see, we do see elevated rates of mood disturbance, of headaches, sleep problems, and stroke was particularly marked. Let's turn now to what we know about overall function years after a brain injury. these are some startling results. We're looking at 5-year outcomes of persons with a brain injury. And I don't want to lose sight of the last column. And this is a narrative that we do not hear as much about. These data, like some of the others I've shown previously, come from the model system. These are individuals with what we would have considered more severe injuries that required inpatient rehabilitation. So we're not talking about sports concussion, we're talking about injuries that did require inpatient rehabilitation care. And so that is why we are seeing this mortality rate that is alarming, disturbing, and I hope modifiable. But again, even individuals with injuries requiring this level of care, we see improvement. If you've ever seen a talk that I've given, you've probably seen this slide because I think it's so important. This is a paper led by Dr. Corrigan and Dr. Hammond. And what it shows is that, so the Glasgow Outcome Scale Extended is a general measure of functional outcome. And what we see here is that change is more common than stability. And this is looking at people living with brain injury up to 15 years post-injury. We see people who decline, we see people who improve even many, many years post-injury, and we see people who remain stable, but most are either improving or declining. I'm not going to ask you to try to really interpret this, but I want to share this because I want to give credit to so many of our colleagues who are making our use of existing data more relevant to people living with brain injury. I'll zoom in on something in a moment, but this study led by Whiteneck, it it shows us more about how functional outcomes 1 year after injury and age at injury influence trajectories of outcome over time. In general, increasing disability at year one does associate with increasingly poor outcomes over time. And of course, mortality rates increase as age at injury increases. But this kind of work gets us closer to saying, okay, here's where my loved one is. What might their paths look like? So let's just zoom in quickly I picked kind of the middle range of function, one of the middle age groups. This work is highly informative. Like look at this example where we see, maybe contrary to what you might expect, we see more improvement in the group that was lower functioning at year one post-injury. And we see a subgroup of those who are doing better who go on to die at rates that are larger than what we would expect. It's a tragic but not an uncommon observation across our studies where we see sometimes that those who have functional impairment but who are functioning well enough to engage in serious health risk behaviors may be at greater risk for premature mortality that could have been avoided with effective behavioral interventions. I hope you're seeing a theme here where there are many missed opportunities to intervene and improve health, longevity, and life quality. We've also looked at rehospitalization as a proxy for chronic health. And you see from this image that rates of rehospitalization remain quite high, even up to 10 years post-injury. This work was informative, but at that time in the model systems, the data we had available didn't tell us enough about what was causing people to be rehospitalized. And we want our research to be actionable. We want to learn enough from our studies and from the data that we collect that we can do something about it. So we changed the way that we collected the data. We started asking people not just, were you rehospitalized, but why were you rehospitalized? And we coded it using an existing coding structure. And this began to reveal some important trends. In the first few years, so these columns are years post-injury, year 1, year 2, year 5, and year 10. In the first few years, we see what seems to be, some planned procedures following craniotomy, craniectomy. We then start to see stroke risk becoming more prominent. We see epilepsy remains a common cause of rehospitalization across all years. And then things like fractures, injuries, trauma-related joint problems start to increase over time. perhaps reflecting falls or other new injuries. Mood disorders also over time become more common reasons for rehospitalization. I think that this is apparent to everyone in the audience. Trajectories after a brain injury are heterogeneous, they're complex, and they're non-linear. So when we do what many of us have done for too long in our research, and we just look at the group trajectory over time, which says on average, people with brain injury, things may be changed in this direction on average. This doesn't help people to act upon anything to advance and improve their health. Um, this uninspiring and sort of uninformative line is something that we're trying to get away from by implying a better, more advanced statistical methods that are better suited to address the types of questions that people with brain injury and their families want to know answers to so that they can act upon them. This is another study using model system data led by Dr. Kumar, where we looked at how comorbid health conditions impact functional outcomes over 10 years following traumatic brain injury. You see in these three figures, first there's motor outcomes and then cognitive outcomes, and to the right, satisfaction with life over time. And you can see quite clearly that the number of health conditions is a important driver of change over time in each of these outcomes. We'll talk about post-traumatic neurodegeneration or dementia because this is a concern that has been expressed by many individuals living with brain injury. First, I want to just define the terminology. Because we know that after a traumatic brain injury and after a period of recovery, many people may have chronic cognitive or other symptoms, but they remain stable. Stable changes after a brain injury, so stable function after a brain injury, even if it's not what it was before the injury, that is not a progressive dementia. That's the middle line that you see here, stable function. Um, Also want to call out that top line where we do see people improve across so many studies, so many data sets. The red line is what we consider post-traumatic neurodegeneration. It's a decline that is defined by change relative to post-recovery, highest level of function. There's a study that we've been able to work on with colleagues across the country. It's called the Late Effects of TBI study, and one of the main goals is to better understand reasons for and ways to prevent post-traumatic neurodegeneration. In this study, people living with a brain injury come to one of our many study sites for cognitive testing, motor testing, questionnaires about mood and behavior, a blood draw, and an MRI. They make known their wishes for brain donation, which is a uniquely powerful gift in a study like this because we have precious data that were collected during life. And this means that we can examine how brain pathology relates to behavior during life. We can see how that pathology relates to signals that were detectable in blood during life. And we can see at ultra high resolution the unique signatures of TBI related changes that we can then look for in the brain scans that we collected during life. Studies like this, and this isn't the only one, are what get us closer to diagnosing post-TBI dementia while people are living when we can do something about it. Words matter is another theme that we have talked about quite a bit when we think about brain injury as a chronic condition and what we want to convey with those words. Almost as a prelude to that conversation, I want to just define what is a traumatic brain injury. I think everyone on this call likely is well aware, but I want to just distinguish that from repetitive head impacts. Repetitive head impacts are repeated exposures to impacts to the head over a prolonged period of time. These individual exposures may not in isolation result in the symptoms that would meet criteria for a traumatic brain injury. Repetitive head impacts to date have mostly been studied in male contact sport athletes. But I just want to emphasize that it's a different exposure, and that's important because it may have different clinical and biological consequences. The reason I want to make this distinction is because what we're learning in many different studies is that it is relatively uncommon for a person to have one isolated traumatic brain injury. In people who have a brain injury that requires significant clinical care, even inpatient hospitalization, um, almost half also have some exposure to repetitive head impacts. We have found that more women than that we previously appreciated also have experienced IPV, intimate partner violence related brain trauma. And in our studies, and we have seen similar numbers across many different cohorts, the model system, track TBI, most people have more than one traumatic brain injury. So when we think of brain injury as a dichotomous thing, either you have one or you don't, we are oversimplifying in a way that may limit our ability to most effectively manage long-term care. So I'm sharing the slide to say, let's lean into this complexity. We do need to understand how a history of brain injury impacts the outcomes after the brain injury being currently treated and how that may impact future risk for brain injury. Now, in preparation for this talk, which was very widely advertised, I did receive quite a number of emails from people sharing their stories and asking if I was going to talk about CTE. So I feel like a DJ. I'm trying to give people what they want. I added a few slides. CTE is a brain pathology that can only be diagnosed after death by studying the brain under a microscope. There's a consensus-based definition for this brain pathology, and it seems to be somewhat unique to repetitive head impacts. Most of what we know about CTE comes from elite football players. The media attention has fueled interest, concern, awareness, importantly, but in some cases also fear. Since the New York Times first launched a series on CTE in 2007, and as recently as I think this is yesterday, 2 days ago, there have been over 1,300 articles on CTE in this one media outlet alone. This is an important opportunity for us as scientists and clinicians and advocates to translate research accurately and objectively. So here are the slides as requested. CTE is very common among professional football players whose families were concerned about CTE and chose to donate their brains to a CTE brain bank. This is not a statistic that should be interpreted to mean that this is the rate of CTE in people who play professional football. Those nuances are critical to understand. Most of what we know about CTE comes from male football players, and we should not be quick to translate to other groups. In individuals with a history of intimate partner violence, in the largest autopsy series conducted to date, we found CTE in 0 decedents, suggesting that CTE is not the primary pathological driver of decline experienced by some survivors of intimate partner violence. CTE is rare in the general population. We've now replicated this finding in several large brain banks. Our TBI brain bank in the Late Effects of TBI project is growing. It is still small. CTE seems to be rare in isolated TBI. Almost all of the cases with CTE in this brain bank had substantial exposure to RHI. There was only one case where we found any CTE in a person who had 2 severe TBIs. This tells us that CTE is not the primary pathology of isolated traumatic brain injury. Okay, what I will say that we are learning quickly, not fast enough, but this has definitely advanced quite quickly as far as research goes, is that CTE seems to be largely unique, not entirely, to contact sport play. Um, Post TBI pathological change may be quite specific to the types of exposures. We see something a little bit different in military service members who've been exposed to repetitive blast. We see very little CTE unless the service member also played a contact sport. But there may be a unique pathology that may or may not be more specific to blast exposure in particular. Intimate partner violence, um, injuries, which include repetitive head impacts, isolated blows to the head, and anoxic and hypoxic injuries depriving the brain of oxygen, we see an enormous amount of vascular and traumatic pathology and also inflammatory pathology. Isolated traumatic brain injury results in a wide range of distinct pathologies, including hemorrhagic tissue tears, and new evidence is suggesting that the pathology may be amplified by or at least proximal to traumatic lesions. Again, are seeing a lot of vascular and structural pathological changes. The last thing I'll say about the current state of knowledge regarding brain injury as a chronic condition is that the people who may be at risk for the worst outcomes are underrepresented in our research. Um, this has limited the fullness of our understanding of how and for whom and why brain injury may evolve into a chronic condition. It's essential that we recruit from the community when we are doing research studies. And from a public health perspective, I can't underscore enough the importance of developing a nationwide TBI surveillance program. How best to do that? Well, many on the call have led a lot of this work, and the CDC, in collaboration with other groups, have really pioneered some of this work. But I just want to add that most recently, at the NIH NINDS supported initiative to re-examine how we characterize brain injury severity, a group led by Dr. Corrigan really examined the evidence for retrospective identification and characterization of traumatic brain injury, which is a critical step for a evidence-based monitoring and surveillance program for traumatic brain injury. And this group made some specific recommendations for how best to retrospectively identify and characterize traumatic brain injury. The use of medical records alongside self-report and other report using structured, standardized tools is the recommendation of this expert consensus group. So again, we've seen a tremendous acceleration in research and care guidelines for traumatic brain injury. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published this consensus report just a few years ago. This comes from the TBI Forum, and already several federal partners have joined forces to act upon some of the key recommendations, such as I just mentioned, how we characterize TBI severity. However, care still fails our survivors. We need to manage TBI as a chronic condition, and major barriers to this still exist, including lack of a comprehensive framework for chronic care. So, what now? I mentioned this earlier. This was a cause for celebration, the addition of traumatic brain injury on the list of chronic medical conditions by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This was done by creating a new chronic condition category called conditions that may cause cognitive impairment and including traumatic brain injury in this list. We see this as an important milestone, but guidance and implementation so that we can act upon this is still urgently needed. NASM recently convened a workshop of experts that summarized evidence and now serves as a powerful tool for education and advocacy. I strongly recommend downloading the proceedings from this workshop. They are available on the NASM website. We have to be thoughtful about how we communicate about brain injury. Again, words can affect whether a person qualifies for services, how professionals plan their treatment, and how people understand brain injuries. Um, Importantly, the words that we use can affect how a person with brain injury experiences their injury. And they also shape public attitudes and expectations about life after a brain injury. These labels, mild, moderate, severe, um, they don't serve us. A person's outcomes depend more on the care they receive, the rehabilitation they receive, the personal circumstances of their lives, and their social supports. Brain injury can lead to disability, but not always. Not every chronic condition leads to disability. A person may be more or less or not at all disabled, depending on the support they have, the place they're in, and the accommodations and supports that are available to them. Chronic brain injury can be managed to minimize its impact on life quality. And importantly, not everyone will experience chronic symptoms all the time or even ever again. That said, knowledge is power. So, how do we realize a care system that effectively treats TBI as a chronic condition? This stages of care journey image is, I think, intentionally messy because it reflects the reality. And when I first saw this, my first reaction was that the stages of care is full of off ramps. It's full of opportunities to get lost in the system. And there are far too few on ramps for people with brain injury to reconnect to the rehabilitation and follow up care that they need to optimize recovery and reintegration. We've heard this refrain many times that brain injury care in the United States is front loaded. And this is so true. This one box of acute care, that is most of our nation's investment right now in brain injury care. And thankfully, this has led to dramatically improved survivorship. But we need the investment to extend beyond those early stages so that the later stages can be characterized by optimal function and not reactive care. This recent study, in an effort towards getting us closer to a chronic care management framework, they asked people with brain injury and their families, what do you need to manage your chronic care after a brain injury? And they organized the key themes, as you see along the bottom of the slide, by person, family, provider, system, and community levels. The main themes were lack of preparedness, barriers, and support needed for community and social participation. This kind of a paper is a blueprint. Um, Asking people living with brain injury and the people caring for them what they need has historically not been a major driver of the development of care models. And it's amazing that we are seeing this more commonly, that care efforts and future mapping is happening together with people who are most affected, and that we as clinicians and researchers have dedicated our careers to serving. So let's just step back here. Here's what we're working with. We have biological bases for chronic diseases, as we've discussed, and some of the same processes underlie and contribute to neurological and multi-system health outcomes. And again, sometimes we're talking about more than one TBI, and others can get overlooked, even when their impact on health can be cumulative. We know that a traumatic brain injury can cause cognitive, behavioral, mood, motor changes, and each of these can impact health management in different ways, whether it's forgetting appointments or difficulty managing medications, or barriers to getting to appointments. The health system is not yet prepared to treat brain injury as a chronic condition, and too many people are navigating their health care alone. It is true, I think, to say that the path of recovery and living with a brain injury is characterized by missed opportunities. We have gaps in recognition and diagnosis, a lack of education. We have rehabilitation that's discontinued too soon and not reinitiated at appropriate doses. We have a scarcity of TBI-informed clinicians and specialty providers. We put the responsibility on survivors to manage and navigate a chaotic healthcare system. We have limited surveillance and health monitoring over time. And again, care is reactive rather than focusing on prevention and health optimization. As I mentioned, many of those common comorbidities and reasons for rehospitalization are preventable and or treatable. And many of those same preventable and treatable conditions are risk factors for dementia. We've made really important strides. Dr. Flora Hammond has led a project called the Be Healthy Project with support from NIDLR. And the Be Healthy model now provides a comprehensive guide for managing chronic brain injury. So this is based on available evidence from expert clinicians, researchers, people with lived experience. It's built off of a very comprehensive chronic care model. It's called Wagner's care model. And it was selected as a starting point, but with several key changes and refinements to accommodate the unique needs of people with brain injury. So the Be Healthy model, it endorses a person-centered approach, recognizing that the individual with brain injury and their social support system are the primary sources of goal setting and care planning. The model also acknowledges the importance of self-management and the need for healthcare programs to actively promote self-direction, self-management by encouraging a person to use their social supports. And it also encourages the recognition of the fact that outcomes are they're not determined solely by the person and the injury, but they are determined very much by the environment in which they are in. And so there is a need to integrate healthcare with community-based resources. This also helps fill in those gaps where community resources can fill in missing pieces that the health system is not yet prepared to provide. Um, Again, this model embraces environmental influences and recognizes and I think promotes a shared responsibility of the community, the care system, and the broader healthcare system. So I want to just close with a question that a few people reached out to me via email to ask, what can I do today? What can I do today? Because sometimes it feels overwhelming. I do believe, have made major strides, but I also feel every day that we have so much more left to do. So what is actionable today? I always think about with every single person that I have the honor to work with or to treat is what is modifiable, what's under our control. The first is identifying resources near you. Sorry, Brain Injury Association of America is a huge resource that can help people get connected to providers near where they live. Tell a friend or colleague about brain injury. Um, I was told that almost 2,000 people registered for this webinar, and if we all access the wealth of information that exists around us and we tell 5 people about brain injury, and then those 5 people tell 5 people, it'll be the most effective informational campaign in the history of the world. Not enough people know about brain injury. There are a lot of misconceptions. Let's help shape the narrative. You can participate in a research study. I know as a researcher, this sounds like, of course, obviously, this is what she's saying, but research is an advocacy tool. Research fuels advocacy. The people who participate in research often tell us that it is empowering, it's meaningful to them. The people who chose to participate in research in the last 20 years are to thank for the progress that I just talked about. We wouldn't be this close to identifying more and better treatments if not for people who signed up and said, yes, I'll help. Um, and yes, we want you to do research studies if you're doing well too. Research is not just for people who are struggling after a brain injury. We can learn an enormous amount from people who are doing very well. I'm putting up some resources where you can reach out and say, I want to be in a study. Do you know of one? The Model Systems Knowledge Translation Center keeps a running list of research opportunities and can do a great job of connecting people. 2 weeks ago, our advisory board at our research center told us that we're not doing enough to tell people with brain injury about brain donation. This is a very personal and private decision that should be discussed with people's families. Um, but our advisors literally said people with brain injury don't know that this is an option and how important it can be. So if people are interested in it, there are resources online, and we are happy to help connect people to those resources. Check in on a friend. Loneliness is an epidemic, and it has hit the TBI community. Being lonely and being alone are not the same thing. Um, Homeboundness, which is defined in the research world at least as being home, I'm sorry, leaving home 2 or fewer days per week. This is associated with a 70% greater risk for mortality within 5 years after a traumatic brain injury. We found that almost around 14% of people in the model system database were homebound at 1 year post-injury. Um, I'm saying check in on a friend because I know, especially when it's cold outside and communicating isn't what it once felt like, and relationships start to feel different, the easiest thing is to cancel plans, but it's a slippery slope and your world can get small. Check in on a friend. Activate your body and mind. You're doing it now. You already started. Uh, we are learning from our colleagues who've been studying Alzheimer's for 100 years. And I'm seeing such hopeful studies that are telling us that activating physically and mentally is a way to reduce dementia risk substantially. Um, let's build upon this. Let's borrow from this knowledge and act upon it. The last thing I'll say is to please write to your elected representatives. You can go online and figure out who they are and how to contact them, but we are under-resourced. TBI is common. It's a major public health issue, and we can't let our voices be drowned out by other understandably pressing concerns. We need to be loud. This last year showed us how important it is to show up. And as we heard from Dr. Corrigan in the beginning, Brain Injury Awareness Month is right around the corner, and there are many opportunities to speak and be heard. We've come a long way. We now have a much stronger evidence base that establishes how and why brain injury can evolve into a chronic condition. We are now in the action stage. What can we do at the health system level and at the individual level? I am very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you all for listening, and I think we have some time for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dams O'Connor. We do have a few questions. Some of them I've been trying to do some live answering, but I will get to those of you that I haven't. I did want to give Dr. Dams O'Connor to respond. One of the overarching questions I can summarize is a lot of the discussion and the focus on traumatic brain injury as a chronic condition. Some are wondering how this initiative does or does not tie to people that have experienced an anoxic brain injury and or a stroke.
It's a great question. As I'm sure you well know, a traumatic brain injury and an anoxic brain injury, a stroke, they all fall under the umbrella of an acquired brain injury. And many of the same health risks, lifestyle changes, and interventions would be helpful for this range of acquired brain injury. And so it is not the intention of some of these messaging initiatives and certainly the care advancement initiatives to be limited only to traumatic brain injury. So thank you for asking that.
Yes, I think that's a really good question. Sometimes we are challenged with the words we use when we talk about brain injury, and that's so it is good to. So I'm glad those people were asking to help us clarify. Uh, One question that came up early on in your presentation was about strength training and regular cardiovascular ADMs, and how that may help a person during their recovery.
It's a great question. So the last couple of slides actually that I alluded to come from studies of individuals at risk for dementia. These are not brain injury studies, but there is a growing evidence base that cardiovascular exercise, which includes walking, which can include locomoting in a wheelchair, other assistive devices, it can include seated physical activity and strength training, are helpful in ameliorating risk for longer term health problems. And so there is, as I'm sure you well know, a huge range of treatments that have a big range of scientific support. You can go online and find a whole bunch of interesting options, but exercise is one that I think with the green light from your doctor is one that I would squarely place in the category of it can't hurt you and it very well may help you. So go ahead and do it.
Excellent. Thank you. There was a question about diagnosis, and I believe you touched on this a bit of the classification system. And so, what is the best practice to diagnose? I know this is a way to how do you do this in a snapshot, but what's the best way to diagnose TBI or flag for a possible history of TBI?
Thanks for asking. I believe that there is another webinar focused on this topic that will be focused entirely on the recent NINDS initiative to re-examine how we classify and characterize traumatic brain injury severity. That was an international effort that brought together experts from a huge range of backgrounds and people living with brain injury. And one of the working groups focused exclusively on retrospective characterization and identification of brain injury. And the reason that we had a group entirely focused on that is because so many brain injuries are not recognized in the moment. Many do not seek or receive medical care. And we knew we needed evidence-based ways to not just identify and diagnose, but to characterize the gravity or severity of those injuries. So I don't want to creep onto the turf of that talk, which really deserves its own um, uh, extended conversation. But the manuscript, and I'll share these slides on retrospective characterization, will be a great starting point.
Excellent. And I know we probably won't get to everything, but um, another question that came up from multiple people was about exposure to blast injury outside of the military setting. So, for example, maybe first responders, and how is that connected to sort of chronic TBI?
The simplest answer is an unsatisfying one, and it's really that we don't know. Um, there are many of us that are studying repetitive low-level blast in military service members. And in doing that, we are trying to get guidance from studies that predated this as like a military-focused initiative, such as previous studies of coal miners, for example, or first responders. It appears that there are differences in dose, for example. It seems that some service members, depending on their tour of duty and their rank and role, um, have higher sort of doses, if you will, of exposure to blast. And that may be one thing that makes it different from some of the other occupations in which a blast exposure can be a contributor to overall health. What we're seeing in in those with higher levels, even of low level blast, is that there does seem to be a chronic consequence, at least in a subset of people who are exposed. And like many of these exposures, the important questions are things like how much is too much? How can we quantify exposure so that we can remove a person from risk before they are at elevated risk for long-term consequences? And then, of course, as always, why is it that some people have these exposures and have no downstream consequences and others do? This is one of the reasons that I'm saying that people who are doing really well, we still want you in research because that is how we start to understand protective factors and not just risk factors.
Very good. Okay, I will leave it. I think we're right at 3 o'clock. I'm going to say we do have questions about how to get involved, whether you're a student, whether you're undergraduate, whether you're a researcher, a health professional, caregivers. I would encourage you all to visit our website at biausa.org. We do have information on how to get involved. There's also information on brain injury diagnosis, including the information that Dr. Dams O'Connor presented. We had a feature in our Challenge magazine. So you may find signing up for our newsletters or magazines helpful to get access to the latest information, as well as upcoming talks to hear from experts like Dr. Dams O'Connor. And she did a reference to an upcoming webinar. But that, I think we're at time or a little over. So, thank you so much. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to everybody's question. If you had a question, survivors, caregivers, please reach out to the National Brain Injury Information Center to make sure that you get to talk to someone about your questions and concerns. And thank you.